All right, so we are almost towards the end of this particular module. This will be our last mini lecture. And I wanted to spend this time just talking about the racialized aspects of poverty. In the US, the term that we use is culture of poverty. Now, this was a term that was coined by Oscar Lewis. He was an anthropologist who was studying slums in Mexico, right? And what he encountered was people who had been in poverty for generations due to structural reasons, largely due to industrialization and the folks that were left behind. And what Oscar Lewis noticed was that children who grew up in this particular context learned survival skills with very scarce resources. And Lewis found that if you were to present opportunities to these children to enter the mainstream through educational opportunities, etc., he believed that they wouldn't really be able to make use of those opportunities because they were mostly socialized to survive. Right? So that's kind of simplifying what Oscar Lewis presented as his argument. Remember now, Lewis was saying that this was an adaptation that he was noticing to structural conditions that existed. Now, this was brought to the US by a popular journalist, Michael Harrington, right, who wrote about American poverty. The theory has been heavily disputed by many social scientists, especially the co-optation of it by the conservative right. So what happened in the 1980s with the coming of the Reagan administration, neoliberal policies, is that folks jumped on this idea. They forgot about the structural conditions bit and simply made it about cultural pathologies. There are particular racial and ethnic groups, the argument became, that have pathological culture. Now, what's interesting is that this was built on an idea presented by Patrick Moynihan, who was a self-professed liberal, in fact, right? And in 1965, he presented the Moynihan Report, which was officially titled that the Black Family, the Case for National Action, right? And he talked about how African American family values produce too many fatherless households, right? What he called the tangle of pathology. It's self-perpetuating, self-defeating cultural flaws responsible for persistently high rates of poverty and violent crime within the African American community. So essentially what he was saying was, it's this single female-headed households. That's the main reason why we see a disproportionate number of Black folks in poverty. And you see manifestations of that, weaponization of that argument today as a justification to cut programs, right? To cut funding to programs such as SNAP or any other kinds of support systems, right? Essentially, the idea is that these folks, there's something about their culture that just locks them into poverty, right? It's not the structural conditions of residential segregation or ongoing discrimination or historical atrocities committed against this group. No, it's something about their culture that they don't take personal responsibility, right? So it very much devolves into a blaming the victim argument, right? And it affects policymaking. For instance, under the Bush administration, millions of dollars were spent on let's get married a program which said that we should just try and make sure that these Black folks in poverty get married, stay in their marriages, and that will somehow uplift the folks from poverty. And already a lot of folks were saying, shouldn't we be investing the resources in giving job training to single mothers so they can support their family, etc.? But no, it seems like we are stuck in that 1950s kind of ideology. What's amazing is that this dominant ideology is even internalized by many folks, influential people in the Black community, including our former president, Obama, who would often give speeches about personal responsibility, about pulling your pants up, essentially, respectability, politics, and so on. Now, don't get me wrong. As an educator, as a parent, of course, I'm going to talk to young folks about resilience, hard work, grit, about working really, really hard to achieve your dreams and all of that. But to pretend that it's only about hard work is just being untruthful, right? If we're telling our young folks all you need to do is work hard, you are just duping them, right? You're setting them up for failure, essentially, because you're not giving them the full picture that, hey, there are these structural conditions that exist. And it's also about addressing those structural issues, right? That we can't say racial status quo, our economic status quo is fine. It's not, right? You can teach young folks a lot about character building, values, all of that stuff. But if there are no jobs available that pay a living wage, then these issues of poverty will not go away, right? You're noticing this kind of culture of poverty arguments even now with the pandemic. I think most of you have heard how the pandemic affects Black communities and brown communities disproportionately, right? So in San Francisco, the Latinx population is affected. In many parts of the country, Black folks are disproportionately affected, both in terms of cases as well as fatalities from the disease. Immediately, the dominant discourse veered towards saying, well, these folks have pre-existing conditions, right? Blaming the victim. Like, oh, they tend to be obese, they have hypertension, they have a lifestyle that makes them more susceptible. There might even be genetic issues, right? Again, by the way, the favorite thing to do is always to go to the genes, even though scientists, geneticists have always said that there's no genetic basis to race, right? And instead of focusing on structural factors again, about who has access to healthcare, who are our frontline workers, right? How are health outcomes shaped by what you have access to in terms of nutrition, places to exercise, education, all of these different complex issues, right? No, it always devolves back into blaming the victim. Yeah, they kind of brought this on themselves. How are you going to help people who don't want to help themselves, right? And it's infuriating because we have so much evidence from social science research that refutes all of these factors. And as a nation, we have a tendency to have historical amnesia, right? I'm not just talking about slavery and Jim Crow here, right? But also the possessive investment in white supremacist institutions after World War II, right? The federal government poured in lots of money in setting up Levitt towns, these segregated suburban tracts, exclusive tracts, right? Where Black and brown folks were not allowed to buy homes. For the first time, it was possible for you to have a mortgage that was lower than rent, right? Those opportunities were made available to white folks and the so-called white ethnics, right? We read about this. It's the Jewish folks, Italian Americans, Irish Americans. People of color were systematically shut out of those opportunities. And we kept at it, right? So once you had the Fair Housing Act passed, you couldn't legally discriminate against people. But what did the federal government do then? They instituted redlining, right? And you had real estate practices such as racial steering, not even showing certain areas to Black and brown folks, blockbusting, right? Scaring white folks and creating white flight, right? And as sociologists, you should definitely look into redlining. So this was a federal appraisal system, right? Not a private agency, but the federal government deciding that some of these areas are risky investments because they have people of color or integrating neighborhoods. These other white neighborhoods, they're safe investments. Let's give them the color green with an actual marker, right? So you can imagine what that does to the mortgage lending practices once your federal government is telling you, well, this is risky, but this other part, that's good. We continue to see discrimination in present times in mortgage lending practices, right? If you're interested, you can look at the work of Oliver and Shapiro, whose book is called Black Wealth, White Wealth. And they look at these housing audits, which show that your chances of getting a mortgage loan approved if you are Black with a college degree are lower than if you are white without a college degree, right? This kind of discrimination continues in our sharing economy. Airbnb just had a study done to say if Black folks just change their picture from their portrait to a landscape, all of a sudden there's stuff available on Airbnb, right? And an analysis of wealth becomes so important. That's why I have the Pew numbers here. You can see the wealth gap in 2010. Because your family wealth is not simply a luxury, right? It's your starting point, okay? And the gap between Blacks and whites has, of course, increased after the recession of 2008. And we'll see another massive impact that the pandemic is going to have. And I think the biggest argument against culture of poverty would be that when you control for wealth, right, and now you're seeing Black and white folks at the same level of wealth, there is no difference in graduation rates, welfare usage, any of these other measures, right? Having colorblind or so-called colorblind policies simply ignores the fact that we have historical and ongoing racial discrimination, and therefore these policies would only perpetuate the inequities that exist in our system, right? So examining the racialized as well as the feminized aspects of the wealth gap become really important to humanize the poor, right? So when you're thinking about food stamps, remember that it's largely women and children who rely on food stamps, right? So next time you're not feeling very good as a taxpayer who's paying for food stamps, first of all, think of how little that amount is in comparison to corporate tax evasion. And secondly, remember that the recipients, the largest group of recipients are children, right? Those are the folks who go hungry otherwise.